today, I'm very excited to introduce Mihael Cudic, who's going to talk about AI in medicine from code to clinic. Dr. Cudic is a T32 postdoctoral research fellow in precision and genomic medicine at the Center for Precision Psychiatry at Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. He is jointly mentored by Drs. Jordan Smoller and Alcus Price, and he earned his PhD at the University of Oxford, where he studied computer vision applications in visual neuroscience. His current research integrates AI in biomedical sciences with a particular emphasis on psychiatry, genetic neuroscience. And with that, I welcome our speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. This presentation is going to be a little bit different than the other primers because there's going to be a lot less genetics and a lot more AI. But to begin, I think when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's not really a clear definition of what AI is, and I'm definitely not an expert to be able to define it. So I think for the scope of this presentation and the way that we use artificial intelligence in the mainstream, I think really corresponds to maybe some key technological innovations. And we can look at the Google Trends for artificial intelligence, and there's certain spikes that maybe will key us in on what these innovations are. The most obvious one is the release of ChatGPT in November 2022. Once that was released, it felt like everybody was using the term artificial intelligence. And the technology that I think is central in artificial intelligence as we know it today is deep learning. So the structure of this primer, we'll talk a little bit about deep learning, what it is. I won't go too heavy in the mathematics, but it'll give you a good introduction as to what deep learning is. Then we'll talk about convolutional neural networks, generative AI, and self-supervised learning. So most of the data that we'll be talking about in this primer is on medical images. Why? Because artificial intelligence really, I felt, became what it is through its ability to tackle a lot of image data sets, which easily translated into medical image data sets. And then there were different applications that came about that we'll talk about in a little bit. But images were really the foundation for where artificial intelligence built off of. And also, there's some, it's very easy to understand through just the images themselves as to what these AI systems are doing, rather than maybe just seeing some metric performance and seeing how that's optimized. So to begin, let's start with deep learning. What is it? Well, in some ways, it's just a really complicated way to fit a line. You have an input, which are just some numbers, and you have an output. And those inputs can be maybe pixels in an image. It could be the voltage of an audio waveform. It could be a board game state. You also have an output, which are just other numbers. And those other numbers can be a Boolean to determine whether something's true or false. It could be text. It could be a future board game state. And then there's this mapping function that we're trying to learn. And that mapping function could be a dog classifier, it could be a speech-to-text algorithm, or it could maybe be a chess AI. And what essentially deep learning is trying to do, like any learning optimization algorithm, it essentially has some initial parameters. It tries to see how accurately it can predict the thing that it wants it to predict, and then it slowly changes the parameters of the model to get closer and closer to the outcome that we care about. And this is very similar to linear regression, something that I'm sure we're all familiar with genome-wide association studies. But just as a refresher, for linear regression, we can just view it as maybe a slope and a bias. And then we can try to optimize that based on some cost function. So that's a penalty to determine how poorly your model is doing. In this case, it's mean squared error. And then in a gradient descent algorithm where you just slowly adjust these parameters. There's a learning rate and a learning equation to adjust the parameters over time. And we can see on the image in the right how this line slowly changes to best fit the data points. And in a lot of ways, this is what deep learning is doing, maybe not over 2 parameters, maybe over billions of parameters, but this is a very similar concept. And in data science, I think we are all familiar with this. We can have maybe models that are underfit to the solution. So maybe the solution that we want to know is quite complex, but we have less number of parameters that we need to solve the problem accurately. Alternatively, maybe we introduce more parameters into the model and we get a really, really good fit on the training data, but we don't necessarily learn the underlying distribution because we're overfitting to the training data and it doesn't create a general solution. And then ideally, we would want a perfect balance of these parameters to maximally fit this data in a way that can generalize quite well. But understanding what is this balance of the number of parameters that we need, that's quite tricky. So when we think about artificial intelligence, one way to think about it is how do we make decisions? How do we know whether a case or a patient has a certain condition? How do we know whether a certain pixel in an image is that of a tumor? And one way we can think about it, a very simple example, is just a classification problem, where you have some data points that belong to class 1, you have some data points that belong to class 2. And the first solution to this, and kind of the start of artificial intelligence, came from this unit called the perceptron, which was a model of just how neurons operate in the brain and action potentials, where it integrates information, and if the information integrated doesn't reach a certain threshold, then it won't fire, but if it surpasses that threshold, it will fire. And that is kind of summarized by you have some inputs, you multiply it by some weights, you add everything together, and then you have this activation function, which in this case is a step function. Now maybe we could change it into something a little bit more familiar. We can replace that step function with the sigmoid function, and we can see that this equation then becomes a logistic regression, and this is something we should be familiar with. Now, logistic regression can solve some problems, but obviously there are more complex problems we would like a classification solution to have to be able to solve. So logistic regression is really good at solving problems where the classes are linearly separable. But if we see on the example on the right, the continuous XOR problem, where the upper right and the lower right quadrants are one class, and then the upper left and the lower right quadrants belong to another class, one line is not sufficient to separate this data. So we need something more complex. Now, one solution might be, okay, maybe we can add essentially another perceptron to that layer and have a perceptron that integrates the previous 2 perceptrons. And that can give us a solution, but it does better, but maybe it's not the solution that we think of in our head. So another possible thing that we can do is we continue adding perceptrons, and this is called a multi-layer perceptron, an MLP. And this is where we start to get to the birth of deep learning, because we realize we can just make things bigger, and if we make things bigger, then we start getting to more complex solutions. But of course, the complexity of these problems can keep on expanding. And if we see the problem all the way to the right, maybe it's not entirely clear what the solution is. And to go about this, what deep learning tries to do is it not only increases the width of the network by adding more vertical units, stack units, but it also adds more depth, so more layers of perceptrons. And when you keep on stacking these perceptrons, you enable more complex solutions to be learned. So deep learning essentially is just logistic regressions and multiple of them stacked in multiple different ways. Over time, we figured out ways to optimize it more efficiently, moving away from just a sigmoid function to some other activation units. But this is the basis of deep learning. And kind of the main rule of thumb was the more data you have, the bigger models you can train, the more complex solutions you can learn, and the better performance you have overall. And one of the main drivers for all this technological innovation that we see is really propelled by the idea that data keeps on expanding in our society. We keep on collecting more and more data so we can train these bigger and bigger models. So in the early days of AI, as you'll see, a lot of what was being done to increase performance was just to find ways to continue stacking these networks. And that brings us to convolutional neural networks. Not always will it work just to increase the size of these networks. Sometimes it requires certain architectural advancements depending on the domain that you're in. So convolutional neural networks were what was developed for images and started maybe its first applications in medicine. And what a convolutional neural network does is it realizes that an image has translation invariance, meaning that if you take an image of a dog and you shift that dog a little bit, the classification of that image doesn't change. Whereas if you were to take that image and you were to flatten it into a vector, you're going to lose all that spatial information of that image. So what a convolutional neural network does is instead of just having a one-dimensional vector where it multiplies the weights multiplies the pixels by weights, what it does is it takes the matrix, it creates it into a 2D matrix, and it saccades throughout the entire image, or it convolves throughout the entire image, and it tries to find features at any location throughout the image. So you can imagine if it's trying to figure out a dog face, it doesn't matter whether that face of the dog is in the top left of the image or the bottom right of the image, it's translation invariant. So that was a really key technological innovation that allowed for image processing to really become what to have the success that it has had. And also, there were just massive amounts of data that was widely available to start developing these algorithms. So this was a really popular data set and still is. It's called ImageNet. It's 1.2 million images. It has over 1,000 object classifications. The images are RGB, so they're just natural scene images. And it's easy to collect this data because you can just kind of do Google search, type dog, and then maybe download the top 10 dog images, and that could be part of your training data set. And what ended up happening to really excel on this data set, there were a lot of different perturbations to architectures, some of which included expanding the architectural complexity. So what you see in this figure on the x-axis is the number of operations that this architecture uses to compute its final output. On the y-axis is the performance on ImageNet. And you see this trend where if the architecture is performing more operations, it typically does better on this data set. So in some ways, maybe not exactly true, but like the more complex the architecture, the better it is. But obviously, that's dependent on the availability of large amounts of data. And that simply is just not the case in medical imaging. There's different problems that happen when we apply machine learning and AI technology into medicine. First of all, medical images can be a lot noisier than natural scene images. Medical images are three-dimensional when we think of MRI or CT scans. And just the quantity of data is significantly smaller than what we can see for just regular applications of AI. Because we can't just download, 100,000 MRI images. So one technique that was really useful is this idea of pre-training architectures. So when you train a convolutional neural network on natural scene images, some of these perceptrons or these features that get encoded are really useful features for image processing. They can be edge detectors, they can be color opponency. They're these features that end up kind of compressing these images into a way that's a lot more trackable for later on layers to determine whether something is a dog or a cat. But you can't learn these features as well if you play around and train the architecture from scratch on a smaller amount of data. So what pre-training does is it says, okay, well, maybe we can take advantage of these publicly available large data sets and we can train an architecture on that. And then we kind of freeze the early and middle parameters, and we simply retrain the final layers of that architecture on the domain that we care about. So in this way, you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the feature extractors using large amounts of data, but you're also fine-tuning, you're adjusting this architecture to your specific application. And this is when we start seeing its utility in medicine. So I think one of the seminal papers in medical AI was this paper in Nature looking at dermatological images and trying to classify the different skin conditions and its malignancy. It had 129,000 clinical images, over 2,000 different diseases. It used an inception model, which was something that was shown on the previous graph. But interestingly, it was pre-trained on ImageNet. Why? Because if the features are useful for natural scene images, just like as humans, we've evolved to be able to adapt and go through the world in natural scenes, it might be useful to detect skin lesions. And that ends up being the case. And when you do that pre-training, what they were able to show is that performance was on par with all tested experts. So this was when it was starting to challenge the narrative that maybe AI can do as well as clinicians. Now, similarly, this was an architecture used for radiology to pick up pneumonia. And yeah, I think maybe in the mainstream, people were saying that AI was going to come for radiologists. I think this was one of the papers that started that trajectory. And essentially, it's 10,000 X-ray images. In this case, they have a custom convolutional neural network. But again, it's pre-trained on ImageNet. And this architecture exceeds the average performance of radiologists. So what's really interesting about this architecture as well is not only does it give a classification, but it kind of helps localize where the important regions of that image is. And the way that it's able to do this is, as convolutional neural networks, as I explained prior, it's saccading through the entire image. And parts of the image, the architecture, the convolutional neural network isn't really doing much. There's not a lot of activation of these perceptrons. But in other parts of the image, there is a lot of activity. And the basic idea is if there's a lot of activity in that part of the image, then there's something that the architecture is finding interesting. There's probably something that maybe clinicians should pay closer attention to. So that's one way of localizing regions of interest in an image, but we can kind of formalize it more explicitly through image segmentation. So this is an architecture called fully convolutional neural networks. Instead of just outputting one class for the entire image, what it does is it outputs a classification for every pixel in the image. And what you can see here, it kind of is able to segment the differences between the dog and the cat and the background. And unlike the previous architectures where maybe there's a hybrid between convolutional layers and fully connected layers or dense layers, this is fully convolutional. So the entire architecture is just like essentially going pixel by pixel and classifying, or patches of the image by patches of the images and classifying. And you can imagine this is incredibly useful in medicine, but there are additional technological limitations for its application in medicine, one being that medical images are just a lot bigger. And that's problematic because just there's memory constraints for a GPU or a graphical processing unit, one of the key hardwares that's needed in medical AI or AI in general. And this architecture came out. It's called the UNet. What it does quite well, and I don't want to go into too much detail, is it found a way to efficiently represent really high-level, global features of that image in a very low-dimensional space, so very memory-efficient embedding. So you can imagine it might be important in an MRI image to know which part of the head you're looking at. Obviously, that spans multiple pixels, and it's not efficient to store that in multiple pixels, but a UNet tries to compress that. And what we see on the right are just some examples of more biomedical applications of just segmentations of different cells. Obviously, we can take this a step further. We can, instead of just having 2D convolutions and just looking at images, we can instead look at 3D images. And the way we do that is replace 2D convolutions by 3D convolutions. And what we see on the right is a confocal image of a frog kidney. And the right panel of that is the 3D reconstruction of that kidney. And you can imagine that the applications here in medicine are quite big. There's constant iteration of these architectures. This paper tries to come up with just a general approach to dealing with all these imaging data sets, but you can kind of do vascular segmentation, you can do tumor segmentation, and all of this is of interest to clinicians. And one application I find really interesting was the ability to do neural circuit reconstruction. So if you're studying parts of the brain tissue, you can get an EM block of that brain tissue, and you can see the edges of the neurons. But you can imagine just how much data is there. So they were able to use convolutional neural networks to essentially follow the neuron throughout its entirety and kind of reconstruct it as a 3D object. And on the right, you see the reconstruction of the neuropil. This was first done in the mouse retina, but they also done it in the fly brain, and I think as well as the human brain. And now we're at generative AI. And it's a little bit different than supervised learning, and it's harder to define in some ways. In supervised learning, you essentially have some input, like an image, and you have a mapping function to some output that you care about. That can be a completely different domain, like whether something's a dog or a cat, right? But what generative AI tries to do is essentially create another type of data point in the domain that you care about. So in the way that I wrote it here, you have some variable z. So this can be random noise, or it can be a different type of data. And you have a mapping function that takes that latent embedding z and maps it into a new data point x. And this x prime, it should be thought as belonging to the distribution of all other like data points. This will make sense in the next couple slides. So let's say we want to create fake images of handwritten digits. So one of the key architectures, which later got expanded to images, is called a generative adversarial network. And this is when people started becoming really creative with their cost functions and really allowed the explosions of applications in AI. And what a generative adversarial network tries to do is it actually has two architectures that are competing against each other. You have one architecture that goes from random noise to some fake generated image. And then you have another architecture that is a discriminator that tries to determine whether the image it's seeing is from the real distribution or whether it's from the generated distribution. And these two architectures compete with one another so that the generator tries to come up with more and more realistic images. And then the discriminator needs to have needs to learn how to discriminate between fake and real images. And when they compete, they eventually stabilize, and you're left with this generator that's able to just produce a bunch of different fake images. So a very simple application of this is in handwritten digits, but you can also imagine that, yeah, it can be for natural scene images. It could be for faces. We can also kind of expand how we create these generated images. We can essentially condition what the generated image is based off of some other version of that image. So in this conditional GAN, for image to image translation, we have a sketch of a boot, and it's tasked to kind of create an image of that boot. And the discriminator, again, needs to determine whether the sketch and the boot align with one another, but also is a realistic representation of that translation. Yes.
Do you want to go back 2 slides? I just want to understand the adversarial network. So with the discriminator is working until the 2 computers are until the generator is making things that the discriminator is just saying are real? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, so you can imagine like if, they technically need to always be competitive, and these architectures are very unstable because if the generator becomes really, really good at figuring out what is a fake image, then the discriminator just doesn't have the ability to like learn as much, and then it kind of is an easier test for the generator. So the generator ends up not being able to produce maybe the best images. So ideally, they're training together, and then there's a whole like literature on when to stop these 2 trainings, but they can diverge, and that's really problematic. So you can also get the discriminator that ends up becoming so much better than the generator, to the point where the generator is just unable to produce any images because whatever it puts out, the discriminator is like, no, that's clearly fake. So ideally, they're like learning together in a symbiotic relationship of sorts. And if one starts doing much better than the other, then it becomes problematic. Yeah, please ask questions if anybody has questions. So this is really cool. This is also an application of generative AI. It's a little bit of a different twist. This is called style transfer. And this idea is you have some image, and you have the content of that image, but you want to represent the content of that image in a different style, like Van Gogh's Starry Night. And the way that they're able to do this is to minimize the style loss constraint. There's a lot of mathematical jargon in here. I won't really explain it, but this basic idea is to take kind of this texture of one image and apply it to the content of another. And these ideas, these concepts become really useful in medicine when we talk about harmonization. So a huge issue in medical image analysis, as you can imagine, is the MRI images in one hospital can produce slightly different images than from an MRI at a different hospital. And when you try to do analysis, you end up not necessarily picking out the features that you care about, but rather just do stratify based on population differences between these 2 hospitals. So to be able to harmonize the different sites is really important when we start talking about meta-analyses. And there are more conventional or statistical approaches to do this, but we can also frame it as a deep learning problem, where the top row are these images from some site, and the bottom row are images from another site that we want the top row to look like. And the middle row is just essentially the same exact image from the top row, but just in the style of the bottom row. So it's almost as if you're taking that patient and you're re-imaging them in the hospital that you're going to do the primary analysis in. And this also becomes useful in something called domain adaptation. So let's say you essentially have 2 different types of image of the same concept. Let's say you have a PET scan and you also have a CT scan. and you want to go from the CT scan to, from the PET scan to the CT scan, then you can do domain translation. It's the same thing. Instead of figuring out the similar textures between sites, you just find the similar textures between the imaging modality. And this allows you to increase the amount of data potentially, because maybe you don't need such heavy and sophisticated equipment. Maybe you can find cheaper ways to collect all the data that you care about for maybe tumor segmentation, and then you can translate those cheaper images into the domain that you do end up caring about. And this isn't only for images. There are other applications for domain translation. This is going from RNA expression to ATAC profiles, but they're very similar concepts. And it's just basically taking one representation of the data and transferring it to another representation. And it, in some ways, allows you to impute data that might be missing, which could be really useful. And I think that why this is really important, why I brought this in this primer, is because a lot of research in medical AI is really just a game with different publicly available data sets and kind of piecing them together to do the task that you care about. Like ideally, we would have just these massive data sets for the task that we care about, but that just doesn't exist. We have maybe, some data for the task we care about, and then we have lots of data in something that's different but tangentially related. And what we can do with domain translation is we essentially can augment the data that we have by being really smart with the way that we handle it. So you can imagine that if we have an MRI image and we care about tumor segmentation, but we don't have that many images, but what we do have are CT images and tumor segmentations and CT to MRI images, then you can come up with a way to pre-train your architecture without having to collect more of the MRI and tumor segmentation images. And I think this is an example that I found really cool. This was presented in the Center for Precision Psychiatry a while ago. And when she gave the presentation, I was like, this is kind of the perfect example of playing around with the different data sets and domains that are available. And in this paper, what they were trying to do is essentially going from nocturnal breathing to be able to predict Parkinson's disease, looking at just kind of, breathing patterns during night. And you can imagine there's maybe not that much data to do that analysis, but what there is there's relationships between nocturnal breathing and EEG signals, and you can kind of play around with the different like paired data sets, and you can learn really rich representations of these features, which allows for you to require like less data to solve the task that you end up caring about, which in this case is the prediction of Parkinson's. Okay, so now we're going to talk about self-supervised learning, and this is when large language models start coming into play. But what self-supervised learning tries to do is it says, okay, well, maybe there's a really smart way we can just handle the data to make use of the data that we do have. There's so much structure in this data. So for images, a really kind of creative solution is, okay, maybe we take an image, we rotate that image, and we ask the architecture to determine its rotation. And you can imagine that this is actually quite a hard problem because to know that an image of a bird sitting on a branch is upside down, you have to understand what a bird is and what the eyes are and what the branch is. And in doing so, you end up learning these features that are quite rich, and you can use that as the pre-trained features for your network, and then you can do the fine-tuning on the subsequent tasks that you care about. There's so many subsequent applications to this. You can essentially take patches of the image. You can ask the architecture to figure out what part of the image it's looking at. You can kind of show a grayscale image and a color version of that image and ask it to predict the other representation of that image. This becomes a little bit more clear when we start talking about multimodal learning, especially in videos. So what you can do, like with videos, as you can imagine, the sound corresponds to what the image of that video is. And you can have a network that essentially where you shift the audio, you randomly shuffle the audio, and you have the video, and you ask the network to determine whether the audio is shuffled. And if it's able to tell whether it's the real corresponding audio or the shuffled audio, it starts learning and understanding of how a video should sound like. And in that way, you start getting rich features for video segmentation. So what we can see in the bottom right is essentially the architecture learning where the individual sounds of guitar are just based off of the ability to know whether the audio of a guitar was shuffled or not. So in medical applications, we can have maybe a sonographer that is looking at a fetus and at the same time speaking into a microphone, and we can do a very similar correspondence test where we kind of shuffle the audio and we ask the artificial neural network to determine whether the audio is corresponding or not corresponding, and this ends up producing great features for subsequent analysis. In this case, is just trying to show that these architectures, when you do this pre-training, can better figure out the gaze of the sonographer. Yeah. So another application of self-supervised learning, which I think is a lot more ubiquitous, is that of phrase completion. So you can have a sentence after running for miles. She finally reached the, and you ask the architecture to fill that in. And you can imagine that if there's a lot of these sentences, you can kind of blind the architecture to certain parts of that sentence. And that allows for the advent of large language models. I was always confused as to how you can take text and put it into an artificial neural network. And OpenAI has a really good demonstration of this, where you can see the words on the left being tokenized, and they correspond to actual numbers. And once you have numbers, you can train, it becomes differentiable. So you can train architectures to map those numbers into something more useful. And one of the key advances that allowed for large language models are these transformer systems. I don't want to go into too much detail of what a transformer is, but it's a way to integrate sequential information. But it does so such that it allows to focus on specific parts of the sequence at different points in time. This becomes really useful when we're looking at maybe an entire paragraph and we want to predict the word of the next sentence, but we need to know the context of the first sentence in that paragraph. But also transformers are used for any sequence-based analysis. So AlphaFold has been game-changing in terms of protein folding, and a way it was able to do that is through transformers. And with the advent of large language models, there's so many more applications to use it for clinical notes. So one really straightforward application is patient recruitment. The idea is you just take a pre-trained model, something like from OpenAI, and you essentially go through all, a subset of patients, and you try to see which subset is eligible for the trial that you care about. And in doing so and using LLMs, it allows for clinicians to, it reduces clinician effort by 42%, which is quite high. We also can train large language models not only on English text, we can also just train them on clinical notes to have a better understanding of clinical trajectory. These subset of large language models are called clinical language models, or CLAMs. So a really big clinical language model is Gatortron from the University of Florida. It's trained on 82 billion words from clinical notes from over 2 million patients. And in some medical question answering tasks, clinicians were unable to determine whether it was from experts or whether it was from Gatortron. And then finally, I think maybe this is a very exciting future direction, is using these large language models for outcome prediction. So for very rare conditions where you have limited amounts of data, it can be hard to create data sets that have enough samples to do the prediction that you want. But there's some early research showing that if you are able to train just on the corpus of medical text that there is, that it has more contextual understanding. So when you try to apply it for these rare cases, it actually does better at predicting that outcome. And this is a potentially useful to expand artificial intelligence or machine learning past just structured data sets. So overall, there's a lot of great potential with AI in medicine, but there are also a lot of limitations. I didn't really have a lot of time to talk about those limitations, but overall, there's always going to be limited amounts of data, especially in medicine. There's a lot of different sites that can have those data points secure, and there's no public consortium of the data available, so it's hard to run really large models. So there's always going to be innovation on how to adjust these models for limited amounts of data. But equally, I think this is a growing concern, is just making sure that the data stays private. When we kind of have these large language models that learn the corpus of text, it's still trying to understand like how private that information is once it gets absorbed into large language model. And with all machine learning tasks, mitigating bias and hallucinations are a huge problem. If you train on a subset of individuals, maybe of a certain ancestry, and apply it to different ancestry, you will get performance differences. But overall, thank you for the presentation. If you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you so much. Questions. I do have one online I can start with. What are some examples of biological questions or problems that are poor candidates for using OpenAI's pre-trained models and fine-tuning, given that these are trained on all of these?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I know, unfortunately. I feel like that's still an ongoing question because the amount that it can do is probably more is what's driving the research rather than what its limitations are currently. So I think that's still an unanswered question of figuring out what exactly are its best use cases.
Startups then want to accelerate these research. And so how I can understand a lot of the examples that you presented where we're classifying things or even like multimodal making decisions. But to accelerate scientific research, it feels like how does one program that or program architecture to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, that's the trillion-dollar question. I think the angle that they're probably going for is more from this generative AI point of view, where essentially you're taking very defined mappings from two different domains, and you're essentially doing something that's greater than the sum of its parts, like taking the style of Van Gogh and pasting it on a photo of houses. So I think the idea is that if you are just kind of training on all these different data sets, then maybe can kind of pull ideas from different places and create something more comprehensive. But to my understanding, like I haven't seen applications where it was able to like be more creative than an expert in that field. Yeah, I think Terence Tao, he's a very famous mathematician, and he has a blog post where he talks about OpenAI and ChatGPT models in mathematics. And he basically said that they do quite well at solving the problem when you frame it to them already. But I think as a scientist, it's the framing that's always the most challenging bit. So, yeah.
I have like 100 questions, but no one in the room. Okay, so I think the style transfer is really interesting, especially when you have maybe batch effects across institutions. So I was wondering if the results are robust to the data set that you use as like an anchor point.
Oh, like as in, can you switch the anchor
We're gonna
point?
make everything look like hospital A, and then
Yeah.
do everything look like hospital B and do the same analyses. Are you gonna get similar results?
Yeah, I mean, I think like usually the reference point is the one where you have more examples. Yeah, I'm not sure whether you'll have that much variability. Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Yeah.
And then how do these models do with novel findings? So if you had some sort of image for whatever phenotype and it's a rare disease and it's never seen it before, is it forced to go into one of the bins that you're looking at, or are these models able to like flag it, say, hey, this looks something different, like someone?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. In a lot of cases, like AI, where it does really well is when the input output is defined in large quantities. I think for rare cases, I think there's a lot of experimentation of understanding what is a normal distribution of maybe a healthy MRI images and trying to understand those anomalies, because obviously you won't have a lot of examples of what these rare cases are, but maybe you have a better understanding of what a healthy distribution looks like. But I think that's like a huge limitation, especially in medical imaging, because sometimes in these rare cases, in an MRI image, there's so many pixels, but what you care about is in such a small part of that image. So there's just not a lot of signal to train the entire AI system. So this presentation was mostly focused on where AI, I felt, has had the most significance in medicine. And I think it really comes down to how well phenotyped the data is. Yeah.
We have one more online. Is anyone looking at creating scale open data sets like Nomad of medical imaging data? It sounds like one of the biggest issues in the field is just getting access to the data.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot of different consortiums that are trying to do. I think the issue is always with the identification. But even then, if you were to have a public place and I think there are online tools and websites that try to consolidate all this information. But there's always going to be differences in the instruments that are used between sites. Even within the institution, in 10 years' time, we can have a completely different MRI setup that will just change the types of data. So you always have to be cognizant of really the amount of data that's available. And you're always going to have this game of constraints given data limitations. And even if you were to consolidate all these different types of data, I think you'll never get to the scale of more like natural data sets that are being solved in regular computer science, like natural scene images or large language, because the data is so ubiquitous.
Great. All right, let's thank our speaker one more time.